All right, we're going to discuss chapter 25 in 4 different segments. This is the first of 4 segments, and I'm going to kind of open up with a misconception about evolution. Evolution is not actually about the origins of life. Nobody really knows how life arose, although there are several different theories on that. There are scientific views and there are religious views and other types of views. We're going to be mainly concerned with the scientific views because this is a science course. However, right, so I'm going to kind of open up with macroevolution, this term, right? So this is as opposed to microevolution, which we're going to discuss later on in this unit. Macroevolution is basically the broad pattern of evolution, and the broad pattern related to evolution above the species level. So this would be speciation, how new species arise, and their interactions and their ability to, mate and reproduce. Fossil record, which we've talked about already, it shows these evolutionary changes, these macro changes over a very, very long period of time. Now, some of the things that the fossil record can show in terms of macroevolutionary changes include the emergence of terrestrial vertebrates, right? So the vertebrates kind of started out in water, then they moved to land. We can see that in the fossil record. The impact of mass extinctions. So there's been several mass extinctions. Actually, there's extinctions all the time, but several major mass extinctions that have shaped the way organisms are today. And then the origin of certain adaptations, certain key adaptations, such as the ability to fly. We see that in the fossil record as well. Now, your chapter kind of opens up with this surprise in the desert. Here we have, it says, in the Sahara Desert, fossils of ancient whales suggest that there was some transition from life on land to life in the sea. Now that's going the other way around. So here it's saying that, suggesting that ancient whales, because they're found in the desert, perhaps started out on land and then moved to sea as they are today. Now that may be the case, but it may also be that perhaps this desert was underwater when that particular organism that belongs to that fossil died. But however, whatever the true origin of this fossil is, it is a record in which we can use to compare other organisms. All right, so let's look at geologic time on the calendar. So I pulled this up from the internet. It's quite interesting. So if we put all of geologic time on a calendar, all relative to each other within 1 year. So you can see that if we look at this, we've got Hadean, we've got these eons and then eras, and let's see, cyanobacteria arose here. So there was quite a bit of time on Earth, and even the Precambrian, which is way before that, those organisms, there were no organisms on Earth, actually. And then it took a long time. So we'll say, like, what's relative in terms of, geologic time up to March in this particular year, and the end of March for prokaryotes to arise, right? So prokaryotes probably arose before those that were not cyanobacteria. Cyanobacteria can photosynthesize. So the ones that cannot synthesize arose likely before that. And then, look, eukaryotes, single-celled eukaryotes arose mid-year, even later to mid-year. And then really it divides up even further, but really we've got amphibians, we've got reptiles, dinosaurs, mammals, birds. The extinction of dinosaurs happened in December, and that seems so long ago. And today is the Quaternary, right? So it's quite interesting. If we look closer at December, the month of December, we can kind of see this a little bit closer. And this really only goes up. Look at the quaternary. We're in this period which hasn't even existed anywhere close to the length of the other periods. So we've got, look, within this period, the Ice Age, we've got man lands on the moon. That's really the end of it right there. So much has happened even since then. So I thought that was kind of interesting to look at in terms of, relatively speaking, how old Earth was and how young we are. All right, so let's talk about early Earth and the conditions of early Earth and the possible origins of life, at least in the scientific view. Now, conditions on Earth were initially did not support life, right? So Earth had very, very low oxygen levels. It was frozen over. It was often called snowball Earth, right? So but over time it started to change, right? So and then we've got these physical and chemical processes that might have allowed the production of simple cells or protocells through a sequence of stages, which we're going to talk about. Now, these stages include this: abiotic synthesis. What does that mean? Think about it. Abiotic synthesis. It's basically synthesis of small organic molecules before life existed. So it didn't happen inside a cell because cells were not there yet. And then once these small organic molecules were generated, then they could combine, right? So remember the dehydration synthesis from General Biology 1, allowing the production of macromolecules. Then these macromolecules can assemble into protocells. And then what had to have happened was the self-replicating molecules. So remember, you learned that DNA can replicate, right? It can't self-replicate. But it's suspected that RNA was the first nucleic acid. We're going to kind of talk about that. All right, so early on, you learned of these experiments, right, in General Biology 1. The Haldane and Miller experiments. So Oparin and Haldane basically come up with this hypothesis that the atmosphere and early Earth was in a reducing type environment. Later on, Miller and Ari demonstrated that synthesis of organic molecules in the reducing environment that Haldane and Oparin hypothesized were able to be done in the lab without anything living, so just from inorganic substances. However, evidence suggests that the atmosphere was not reducing or even oxidizing. Then what was it? It suggests the atmosphere was more like conditions that were like an eruption of a volcano. So other experiments were done. All right, so organic compounds, it's suspected that organic compounds may have been produced in hydrothermal vents. So these are deep sea areas which are very, very hot. And within these areas, there are a couple different hydrothermal type vents. There's the black smokers and the alkaline vents. The black smokers release water at 300 to 400 degrees Celsius, which is suspected to be way too hot for the generation of organic molecules. It's the alkaline vents. They release water with a very high pH, so it's alkaline, and warm water. It's not hot like, well, it is hot, but it's not like 300 to 400 degrees Celsius as in the black smokers. Here, it could be from 40 to 90 degrees Celsius. Even though 90 degrees Celsius is probably about 200 degrees Fahrenheit, we can't survive in that, but there are organisms that can survive under those conditions. But it's the alkaline hydrothermal vents, which are suspected to be where the origin of life has occurred. Now, meteorites may have been another source of organic molecules. So we have this Murchison meteorite. So this is the meteorite that was found in Murchison, and this is in Australia. After analysis of this meteorite, it was discovered that within the meteorite are organic molecules, including macromolecules like DNA, amino acids, formaldehyde, ammonia, fatty acids, and sugars, right? And of course, water. So maybe meteors landed on Earth and provided the starting material in order to build larger macromolecules and ultimately assemble into cells. The use of things that might have been on the abiotic Earth has been tested in serving as a catalyst for the creation of larger macromolecules. This Earth-like substance is called montmorillonite or bentonite. Volcanic ash would also serve a similar purpose. So it had been tested, and it was discovered that small organic molecules. Now, it's important to know before we discuss this is that there are two key properties of life. Now, there's multiple properties of life, but these are the two key properties of life, at least during the development of life. And that's replication and metabolism. Protocells are like pre-cells. They actually exhibit these two key properties of life, and they may have been formed from vesicles. Remember, vesicles from General Biology 1 in Chapter 6. They are fluid-filled, and they're membrane-bound, organelle-like structures. So it's thought that these would serve as the pre-cells. In water, lipids and other organic molecules spontaneously form these vesicles. You probably discussed this in General Biology 1. And this creates that lipid bilayer. Remember, the hydrophobic portions of the fatty acids, right, lipids, try to stay away from water. So they're going to interact with each other, keeping the hydrophilic part, or the polar head of phospholipids, interacting with water. Now, the spontaneous generation of vesicles was tracked with the application of montmorillonite and without the application of montmorillonite. It was shown that the montmorillonite serves as a catalyst, and it increases the rate of formation of these vesicles. Now, this is shown in that curve that I was talking about. Here we see they tracked relative turbidity. What that means is the cloudiness of a solution. Right? So here, an increase in turbidity would indicate more cloudiness, really, ultimately more vesicles that formed. So if we look at this graph over time, we've got basically the experiment consisted of a control, and this is without the montmorillonite, the red line, and then the blue line shows with the montmorillonite. And you can see that the blue line indicates that because it's hyperbolic, it indicates that the montmorillonite increased the rate of the formation of the vesicles until it became saturated. So this kind of looks like a curve that that an enzyme would actually generate during catalysis. Now, vesicles, as I mentioned, we have a couple key properties of life. Vesicles actually exhibits the ability to grow, the ability to reproduce, and some degree of metabolism. They can actually absorb organic molecules, which would be kind of important if DNA or RNA needed to get into the cell or into a nucleus type structure. So, but they absorb it when it's attached to the montmorillonite. So montmorillonite kind of like serves as a catalyst for the increase in absorption of these organic molecules into the bilayer. Now, this kind of moves us into self-replicating RNA. So I mentioned earlier that it's suspected that RNA was the first nucleic acid that existed, and it's mainly because RNAs, many RNAs that exist today, have some sort of catalytic capability. So the RNA world hypothesis really states that RNA was the first genetic material rather than DNA. Now, RNA, of course, plays a role in protein synthesis. Remember the ribosome? Okay, the ribosomes are made out of RNA. During protein synthesis, the ribosome uses messenger RNA as a template to make the protein, and then, of course, transfer RNAs are also involved in this process. So we've got a bunch of RNAs that have some sort of catalytic capability. RNA molecules called ribozymes have been found to catalyze a ton of different chemical reactions. They can synthesize and hydrolyze. So remember, synthesis is the building of larger macromolecules, and hydrolysis is the breakdown. So these are just some examples of ribozymes that I found that might be interesting to you. Now, in 2013, there was a key experiment showing that a vesicle whose RNA can actually self-replicate within the vesicle that was constructed. So here we've got an enzyme replicase, we've got the self-replicating vesicle, and this creates what would be a protocell. A protocell is like a pre-cell. Right? So then if you link the function with the ribosomes that we were just talking about, it kind of can create a cell, right? So this is basically kind of leading us into the scientific view of how life arose. So a good question would be, did the vesicle, let's say on early Earth, right, grow, split, and then pass on its RNA to the daughter cells like replication, except RNA? If so, the most successful protocells would have increased in number, right? So this was evolution, right? So we've got, let's say, the more successful ones, natural selection, are more likely going to survive and reproduce. Now, RNA could have provided a template for the formation of DNA. So if it started out as RNA, we already know that RNA has some similarities and some differences with DNA. RNA is a little bit less stable. DNA is actually double-stranded, which kind of provides some stability with those hydrogen bonds that are formed when the double strand forms. And DNA can be replicated more accurately than RNA. RNA is very reactive, so I could imagine that there could have been quite a few mutations that might have occurred during the replication of RNA, perhaps more than DNA. So this is the suggested order in which things happened. Let's say we have inorganic matter, so this would be the abiotic Earth, and then the assembly of simple organic molecules, leading to the assembly of more larger macromolecules or polymers. So here we've got like monomers here, polymers here, and then there's a bunch of question marks, right? So we're not sure exactly how it led to, let's say, DNA, RNA to protein. This, remember in molecular biology, this is the order in which things happen. We're not really sure. It's a big question mark as to what happened during that time to lead us to the point right now where we have gene expression. Again, it's thought to be that RNA world hypothesis, that it started out with RNA, perhaps DNA arose and it was more stable, so DNA was selected for. Okay, so let's conclude this segment with a sample question. Okay, so this question states, the following are 4 hypothesized stages of the origins of life. What you need to do is place them in the correct order. Right, so number 1 says abiotic synthesis of organic monomers. Number 2 says the packaging of molecules into membranous protocells. Number 3 says origin of self-replicating molecules. And number 4 says joining of organic monomers into polymers. So membranous protocells and self-replicating molecules probably happened later. And here it says joining of monomers into polymers. I'm thinking monomers would have to happen first. So here, I'll go ahead and give you a few seconds to kind of think of something and see what type of answer you might have come up with. So I'm thinking number 1 should happen first, and then number 4 should happen next. And then you really need the membranous protocell before the self-replicating molecules, matter. This looks like the correct order of the origins of life, and really the way I discussed it in this segment. Well, that concludes this segment, and thank you for listening.